Thank you, Mary. Anyway, it's good to be back here in our Basel, Miami. So today we have a bit of a strange discussion going on here. What you're going to hear in the next 40 minutes is kind of something that was born out of some article I read and that I shared with Mari, earlier this year about the phenomenon of Airbnb and what's happening with urban space in our contemporary situation and the ramifications that this has for anything that not only that is going on in art, but how we perceive it and how art in general operates. It is, at the beginning, it was more theoretical than it is now. Some things have happened in the world in the last month, if you have read in the news. I hope so. Before we go into our first considerations, I want to introduce our speakers. So I'm going to start with Christian. He's an architect from Switzerland, based in New York. I guess that he's more of a New Yorker these days. Someone who has been working across, let's say, the development of these new spaces that we're living in as these spaces developed in the last decade or so. In the middle, we have Matías Duville. He's an artist from Argentina. He is showing some wonderful work at the public sector of Art Basel, which we're going to discuss later on. And then we have Laura Raicovich, she's director of Queen's Museum. I guess that I want each one of you guys to say something you want to say about yourselves, and then we get started on this funny topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Mary Sprito and to Arie for having me here. I'm Laura Raicovich. I'm the director of the Queen's Museum, as Arie said. And I guess, I've been involved with working with artists for my whole career. And I think that especially in this particular moment, that art and culture are centrally important to the way that we imagine not only the future but our present. And art has really the power to make us see the possibilities of what could be, rather than perhaps what kind of elements we might be imagining in our minds. So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and that we try to embody at the work of the Queen's Museum.
Thank you, Laura. Matías.
Hi, I'm Matías Duville. First of all, I would like to thank for inviting me to this prestigious panel. I consider myself as a drawer, but some year ago I started experimenting installation objects, wherever. It's gonna be interesting to connect my work with the main idea of this panel. So, thank you.
Christian.
Thank you all for coming and for the invitation, Mary and Arie. My work is mostly, I would say, in the art context. I collaborated a lot over the years with artists, and then started doing their lofts, and soon gallerists hired me for their architectural projects. And so meanwhile I do mainly buildings for galleries and for private clients. And at the same time, my practice also always experimented in other fields, such as stage installations for performances that took place at Documenta or at the kitchen, or we also do objects that have like lamps and so on, that have a second function that goes beyond what would usually be expected from a design object. So like a lamp that would also, when you look through, turn the world upside down.
Okay, so I'm going to start opening the topic itself. Like I said, we need to have a bit of some theoretical considerations in order to understand, I mean, the implications that we are talking about beyond the here and now. So we start with the question of what's happening with space, how space is being transformed today. We can see this process of homogenization across major and not so major cities throughout the world. We are not talking only about I mean this commonplace topics of homogenization like museums and malls and public space, but we are also talking about residential dwellings. And with residential dwellings, the way that we think about architecture in general, the way that we think about ourselves as spatial beings, and how the social relations that we have or our social interactions themselves build the spaces in which we inhabit. There is some commonalities between different countries, different latitudes and cities, and how cities are being projected into the future, creating this sort of homogeneous aesthetic. The article I was mentioning, which inspired this discussion, once a shortened version of it appeared in The Guardian, and it talked about the rise of this, they call it a hipster aesthetic, taking over the world. I mean, of course, it focuses on these places that we know well, Paris, London, New York, but also speaking about how this is spreading throughout the planet. So here, airspace refers to the Airbnb phenomenon and to this space which is completely fluid. It's a space without politics, without history. It's transparent, it's neutral. In a way, also very defined by a certain specific social class of this global class of travelers that no longer need passports, and it seems now they don't need homes either, because there is the seamlessness of this residential space. When we have to live in such a situation, how do you create a third space? Third space is a word which somehow I started thinking about it because of this panel, so doing some research, I learned that this is a word that has some sociological meaning. It comes from some Russian psychologists in the end of the 19th century who start talking about, let's say, a third space as this hybrid space in which every human being or every living organism, as he called it, was unique, in the sense of, as this was postulated by later sociological theory, they basically postulated that the division or the analysis of society through gender, class, ethnicity, and so on and on, it's not articulate enough to define the problems that we're going through. There is this artist, Randall Parker, is a media artist who wrote something about third spaces, the fusion of the physical space and the remote space into a network place that can be inhabited by multiple users simultaneously. That's as far as the theory goes. So, and then the central question that we want to ask is, where is this third space located? And also bearing in mind space not just as a place, but as a functional multi-layered structure, which includes our bodies and our interactions and the objects that we lived in, art and otherwise. So I guess that because of the poignancy of the question of space, also of how public space exists today, how public space is being suffocated, there are so many examples of it in this country going on as we speak, because I guess that Laura is the person who is the closest to this question, and perhaps to the temporary solutions that are being created as we speak. I would like you to tell us a bit more about the specific work that you have been doing at the Queens Museum, and like what's going on in Queens that requires the thinking about space.
Sure. You know, I was really delighted when I saw the phrase third space in the title of this talk, because it's something that I'm thinking about very deliberately now, and I'll tell you why. The Queens Museum is a building that was built in 1939 for the World's Fair. when the World's Fair was located in Flushing Meadows Corona Park, the park that is actually the third largest park in New York City and was built to accommodate the fair by Robert Moses. The building itself was the New York City Pavilion for the fair, and then subsequently, after the fair was completed from 1946 to 1950, the United Nations actually met in the building that is the Queen's Museum now, while the UN was being built in Manhattan. And then the building, again, was the site of the New York City Pavilion in 1964. So you have, and then it became the museum in 1972. So you have a public museum. The building itself is owned by the city of New York, like the Metropolitan Museum or the Brooklyn Museum. And the Queen's Museum actually pays $1 a year to keep the lease on the space. So therefore it's a public museum, although it's largely privately funded. The city provides about 15 to 20% of our annual operating budget. And so in an American context, that's public. And then, so we're a public museum situated inside a public park, which is quite a beautiful thing. Tens of thousands of people use the park every weekend. And in about 2.5 years, we will be the first art museum in the United States to have a public library branch situated directly within the museum. And so I think a lot about what happens in between these kinds of spaces. And the fact that there is perhaps a way of thinking about a third space. I mean, third spaces already happen with libraries being a space between work and home and school and home for many people. But also in the context of Homi Bhabha's use of the phrase third space, which is something I kind of went back to my post-colonial studies from my undergraduate years and started reading about again, and I'm sure he's referring back to some of the theoreticians who you quoted, but his notion of a third space is again coming out of this hybridity and contending that the two spaces that combine are themselves changed in the act of putting them together. And so what I find particularly interesting is that perhaps in a civic sense, these civic institutions, these democratic institutions of museum, library, and park can be nested one within the other and really create something new. And as Arie was intimating, you know, with the kind of increasing rarity of true public space in cities like New York and across the United States and in fact the globe these days, these kinds of public spaces are increasingly rare. So what would it take for a museum like the Queen's Museum to be a civic entry point, to be an entry point into a commons, a true commons, where people would actually consider it a space where they could come and gather without prompting? So, you know, we have free Wi-Fi, we have all these things, but how does one imagine and realize a space that is truly a public space? So that's something I think a lot about because of the advent of this kind of intermingling of institutions.
As we make all these considerations about what space means, and as we had in a discussion that we held earlier today, we see how under the current circumstances in the world, and particularly with what's going on in this country, we feel that the public domain is being suffocated, that there is very little space to breathe. We question whether a museum, or not necessarily a museum, but art is an adequate space for expression and for freedom. Could be, I mean, I don't think that there is a final answer on this, but again, as the public domain is being suffocated to such an extent, there are very few places where the kind of unpredictability of human relations is conserved, as it is in the cultural sector, which is why we still, you know, we hold steadfast to this belief that that it is important to create these spaces. And then this makes me think about this quasi-parasitic relationship that contemporary art has with architecture, kind of a feeding from this, not just from this understanding, but from the analysis of space that happens in architecture also historically. And here I want to turn to Christian, because as I said to you earlier today, it's interesting for us to hear, I mean, about your experience in the sense of like, I mean, you have moved in a context of art and artists and institutions as organization in the arts as an architect. And honestly, if you go through interesting literature in contemporary art recently, there is a lot of architecture going on. But well, neither of us are architects, and probably we don't know what we're talking about. So I want to turn to you and ask you to tell us how this transformation of a space that we were discussing with Laura, and how this changes in, the social, political, and kind of historical changes that we are experiencing today. How are they reflected in the way that the people who make space look at it? How, if you are the builders of space, how do you see these transformations that public space and space in general is undergoing today? Do you think that these transformations are positive or negative? Do you think that there is something going on at all, or let's say, is architecture following only an economic model, or is there a change, a shift in the perception of space? And what do architects think about when policymakers and artists and philosophers are talking about space, public space, urban space? What do you guys think when you hear all of this?
I think it's a discussion that is ongoing, and every generation, not just of architects, but I think people interested in social aspects, how we live together and how we inhabit dense places, which most people now, cities are still growing, and most people are in one way or the other gravitating towards each other. And I think this discussion, right now, with the election that happened last month, not so long ago, it feels already ages, or kind of, it sinks in, I think, slowly with a lot of people. And there was one very outspoken architect, the business partner of Zaha Hadid, who made a public statement that every park and every public square should be basically privatized. Like neoliberalism to the scale where there is nothing left of what I believe is worth living for in cities. There are very good examples of privatized spaces that one can access, that one can do without consuming something, but it's not the same as a public square or a park or even a sidewalk, which is something that we have to be aware. All of these things we take it for granted, or I actually, coming from Switzerland maybe, I always I took it for granted. And I remember moving to New York and once being in a park at 1 o'clock, I just walked in. It was not Central Park, it was somewhere on the Hudson River. And then some guard walked up and said that the park is now closed. And it's well, how come? It's an open thing. I didn't trespass, I didn't jump any gate or anything. No, the park is now closed. And to me, this idea that something like a public space can be closed, and that this also was during the Giuliani years, so it was not really a very elegant way of encountering somebody. It was just that zero tolerance attitude. I was very shocked in a way. And I think back to architecture, I think museums, they tend to have, even though they are often private museums, there is not just the lobby and the atrium that makes you, that tries to impress you. There is a certain idea behind it that it is a place for people to gather, to debate, and it's not. I think it's important that we preserve them and that we fight for them at every step of the way. And so, as architects, yes, I think we are maybe the ones that have a certain we can keep the argument with our clients, but I think the bigger argument is that everybody is aware and fights for these aspects in our cities. So,
Matías, you have a number of works. There is a work now installed at the public sector of Art Basel. Mm-hmm. As you said before, you have a background in drawing. You were practicing mainly drawing a couple of years ago. Yeah. You started working with these, are not just materials, but these really raw materials of our life, of our cities. What happened? Tell us a little bit about this work installed at the public park. What is this material, and what does it have to do with what we're talking about here?
As I told you, I consider myself as a drawer, so I spend a bunch of years inside the bubble of a sheet of paper. So I started experimenting with installation because for me it was like a challenge. So I could say that I like to work with very, very popular materials and to take them to another level, which is not so easy, especially when you are a drawer, because nobody asks you about the materials of a drawing. So I have some images. If you
please.
This is a project called Hogar, and in 2011 I got a Guggenheim scholarship, and I decided to build this kind of mix between an abstract work and a disassembled house in the middle of our typical flat landscape, Pampa Húmeda. In a way, this platform following the aspect of this flat geography. So it works with the pass of the time. The idea of the time is totally natural. So I just build it and wait for some change. So it's a bit funny because this is a very insulated situation in comparison with a big capital. But for me, it's a place of freedom. I live in Buenos Aires, and this place is 4 hours from my studio. So finally, suddenly I found myself going there once a month, taking some pictures, trying to understand the natural time. So
geological time, you mean?
Yeah,
like
geological time. So it works with the pass of the time. So each day is totally different. I consider this piece as an infinite piece. I mean, I'm not controlling the piece, so the piece is controlled by the nature. I could say that this flat house, when I'm over there, I feel two strong. I have two strong feelings. I feel like to be sheltered and at the same time to be exposed. This is the projection of there's something important that, well, as you see, the walls are laying on the ground, so there is an upside down roof. This is built in close to a big lagoon. So when the lagoon is totally full of water, it fills the platform. So after that, after a big storm, this place is full of life in a way. So so for me, it's my third space. It's a place of freedom. It's something that I needed to build.
And can you move over to the other work?
Yeah. This is pressing asphalt. This installation is called Arena Parking. A couple of years ago, I was invited by an institution in Buenos Aires. I was experimenting with asphalt in my studio, and I decided to build this installation. As I told you, I like to work with the very, very known materials and take take them to another level. This is, I mean, here in public section, it's the first time that I did in an outdoor space, so it works totally different.
Why?
Why? Because at first, because it's totally different. This installation in United States, because actually I use cold asphalt. Cold asphalt is a material made to fix roads, which is totally common in my country.
So what you're saying is that, like you're talking about these roads being patched all the time with this material, rather than these seamless grids of roads which you have in a place like Miami Beach.
Yeah, and here is, I mean, for me works even better, because not just because it's an outdoor situation, because it's I mean, in comparison with the context, with the perfect flat surface, with the parkings, the roads, the streets, and this is, I mean, looks primitive.
I mean, and how did you construct this work? Like, what did you do? You go to Miami and you went to this park and say, okay, I'm gonna, like, how do you start building this here? Like, were the materials locally sourced, or did you do some research about this in Miami, or did you bring it from somewhere? What's the process?
No. We bought the material here, which actually is the same. But it's a bit funny because the way I shape the material is totally different. I mean, it's like it's a handmade installation in a way.
So I mean, when you created this installation, this was what you call a site-specific work.
So
this installation, when you created it, I mean, not the iteration that you have at the public sector, but when you first did this kind of work,
yeah,
it was a site-specific project.
Yes.
Okay. So on here, and at this point, I want to go back to Christian and to Laura, who both have some very interesting, I mean, when we talked about the question of like, how do we cannot drop out of globalization, and we cannot drop out of this seamlessness, of this aesthetic seamlessness, of the homogenization of art and architecture, which is, I mean, it's a fact of our lives. But both of you, like Christian, you talk about the site-specific something, talking about this house, which we visited this morning. Probably you could talk a little bit about that. And then Laura, you talked about the hyper-local versus the global as something very specific in the context of Queens. So can you guys, Christian?
Yeah, when we earlier talked about site specificity, I think this is something that architecture can actually contribute to a local spirit of a place. I mean, the Latin term for it is the genius loci, the spirit of a place, which is something that in my practice we consider, it's not actually a consideration, it's more like at first you have to find it, and that means spending time in a place, analyzing and that really, it doesn't matter if that's a small renovation of an interior or if that would be a museum project. Analyzing the situation, meaning how people are interacting with each other in that space, on that square, in that neighborhood, and then to the next level, not only the people, what are like the other influences. And in my case, it's very often sunlight or daylight per se, like to understand how the sun is moving in the course of a year. Where is it rising? Where is it setting? What is it like? If I design a gallery, I know the opening hours are most of the time from 10 o'clock to 6. So what happens in these 8 hours? Are there times where it's too dark to show works without artificial light, or is it actually interesting that that space fluctuates and has actually on a cloudy day you see a little bit less, but actually it might add to the mystery of certain pieces. So I think those considerations, together with studying the history of a place, like when you are building in a city, you're not the first person that that eventually demolishes a building to erect something new. You have to understand what was before you in order to affect the future. And so I think this kind of site specificity is the opposite of what you referred to it a little bit, like to the text of Rem Koolhaas, The Generic City from '94, which paints quite a dark picture of our future, where really everything is just exchangeable, and yeah, every town square has the same Starbucks on one corner and the Victoria's Secret on the other corner. And I think, and every airport looks the same, and every shopping center. I do believe there is a certain, at least there is an awareness now, I think, in society that we are looking again for real, and you will talk more about the culture behind it, but I think that also the built environment is really affecting how we live in a city and how we as people interact together. So that's, I think, something that there is, at least in my generation of architects, I think there is an awareness now that is probably, we are more aware because of the constant fight for it.
But that's a really, I mean, I think we all agree it's a really great way to put it, and also the sense of doing something which actually contemporary art has wanted to do for a long time, which is like to excavate the memory of space. You know, like to let memory be this kind of to become streamlined with the present, so that we can actually settle into the present rather than being too confused by it to act in general. But now Laura, I think, will complement this really nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit about what, well, on two levels. So I think if really great art changes the way we see and experience the world around us, then we really are in a moment where we need to rely on art to contend with our present and not just help us imagine a different future, but actually to see the present. And I think this relates quite specifically to what you're talking about, Christian, about kind of the specificity in which we're living right now, the kind of rise of fascism in many contexts across the globe these days is quite terrifying. And I think, you know, we're talking about cultural values when we talk about the way that people are coming together or coming apart in relationship to those values. So what's interesting about Queens in this context is that it's literally the most diverse place on the planet. There are over 165 languages spoken in Queens. When you take the number 7 subway train through the borough, you know, at each stop there's sort of a different population of ethnicities that come on and off of the train. And the museum itself is a reflection and actually a home to audiences that come from the immediate surroundings of Corona and Flushing and Jamaica and of course of international visitors who are increasingly staying in hotels in Queens because they're more affordable than the hotels in Brooklyn and Manhattan at this stage, as well as, you know, just our compatriots who live in the other boroughs of New York City and people coming from the kind of general Northeast area. But just to say that, you know, when the relationship between the hyper-local in Queens to the global is really fascinating, because when you walk down the street in Queens, you see many, many people who are texting and WhatsApping and Skyping with family and friends who are halfway around the world. And this is a social relationship, a profound social relationship. They may be talking about, you know, their cousin or what they did last night or last week, or they might be conducting some kind of business, but it falls outside of the realm of global commerce. And I think that that's a really big distinction in terms of what globalization means in the context of Queens. And so therefore, what happens in Queens is not only hyper-local, but immediately international. And I think there's an interesting connection around the specificity of that. It's not just carbon copy. It's like the experience of a human being in a particular space and time, bringing their values to that, and then communicating that with somebody halfway around the globe who's experiencing something completely different because of the space in which they live, but yet they're connected in a really deep way. So what I like to think about at the Queen's Museum in terms of our exhibition programming is that in order to be relatable, particularly with more sort of non-traditional museum audiences, shall we say, the work that we show has to be related to the real. It also has to be imaginative and create space for imagination and wonder, but it has to be something that people can connect to in a very real sense.
I guess that is this kind of wealth in a city like New York, which produced something like New York. And in the end of the day, there was an article maybe over a year ago, somewhere probably it was in the New York Times, can't remember now, when they were talking about the gentrification and the housing prices and so on. And they say, you know, in the end of the day, in the past, especially in the past, now as well, but a bit less, people went to New York. They didn't went to New York to become rich. They went to New York to become New Yorkers. They went to New York to step out of tradition, to step out of religion, to have sex, to express themselves, and as many people to become dreamers and writers and fail writers and artists and fail artists and everything that there is in between. It seems to me that also and that this is possible only in this scenario of unpredictability of human relations, which is what's being taken away from our cities, and why this context of this operative context of art is still important. We, as me, like Laura and Christian, me, like we all live in very big cities, which somehow occupy the opposite ends of the polarities of our planet for a long time. But I would like to ask Matías about the periphery, because we are talking about this, you know, if you...
That periphery?
Yeah, like the periphery. Okay. Yeah, about the periphery, about this that we are discussing. How do you see this from not being in New York, not being in London, not being in Paris? How are you looking at this, and how are you experiencing it as an artist, as a cultural practitioner?
It's a bit funny because while Laura were talking about global situation in a big city, I just was wondering how to take my isolated experience in the middle of La Pampa to a big city like New York, because I guess it's easier than there to be concentrated, to get a kind of place of freedom or a kind of creative space. But at the same time, I live in a peripheric area. I know that, which sometimes is good, and sometimes no, of course, because there is a common question when you arrive to United States. How far is Argentina? It's so far, 10 hours. From where? From the center of the world, or from,
But I have something to say about this center and periphery question, because of course, you know, the Queen's Museum isn't exactly in the center of Manhattan, which is, I see this as like a really fantastic opportunity for us to be a little bit more radical and a little bit more experimental than I think some of my fellow institutions can possibly be, because they're constantly under that spotlight. Yeah. And yet I'm still in New York City, right? And so I think there's sometimes ways that we feel like we're in the periphery when we're really not. And, you know, Buenos Aires is
because,
an enormous city.
you know,
so
I also feel that when we talk about periphery, I was thinking about this text of Hannah Arendt when she said, the third world is an ideology. And when she was saying this, I was thinking about this a couple of years, and I was saying, from living in different cities, I mean, from having the experience of living in Beirut, in Istanbul, in being born in Colombia, now living in Moscow, like there is this first world in every city, and there is this third world in every city. And you can see how this construction is strictly ideological. Yeah.
Of course.
And Buenos Aires is a huge city.
Buenos Aires is a huge city. Maybe that's the reason why I decided to
Go to
build
La Pampa.
something in La Pampa. Because sometimes you need to be connected with a capital, but sometimes you need to get this kind of isolation. For me, it's so important because it's like to start again. I don't know. At the same time, once I take the road to be in front of this kind of this assembled house, the idea of globalization disappear, and the idea of periphery area disappear, because there's no art market, there's no curators, there's no collectors, so
yeah, I think
it's
that
something like I mean it's like even I don't think in art, so even more sometimes I feel like a ghost. I'm it's like a method of work, I suppose, to be invisible at least for a moment.
Because I think that when we talk about this of the hyperlocal, I always remembered conversation I had with Mari Espiritu years ago when she said to me that there is not one art world but many art worlds, and that they don't always overlap. Sometimes we have this understanding of the art world as our Basel freeze and kind of that's it. It seems to be a much bigger place, and outside of the really leading institutions, meaning of the biggest marketplaces, the things that matter the most in art, we realize a long time later, are hyperlocal. Yeah. Always, all of them. Before we conclude, I just want Christian and Laura to tell us briefly about, I just learned today they have a project together. So I want them to share some sneak preview here.
Yeah, maybe it's the moment where monumentality from the title comes into play. The Queen's Museum has this amazing model. For those of you haven't been there, I think it's worth a trip. Go now, because if you go in September, it's our exhibition, and it's going to be very different. It has not all actually, I should rephrase. It has some visions of previous generations that have never been built. So the show is called Never Built New York, and it's about visions from Buckminster Fuller covering Midtown under a big dome to unrealized spiraling towers by I.M. Pei from the 50s to floating airports by Bell Geddes in front of Ellis Island, to a lot of Robert Moses visions, which he did not all of them build, luckily to us, because otherwise we would not live in Soho anymore, and so on. And we are using the 1964 model to illustrate that. It's the best place to show these visions, and the form of how we present them is not 100% clear yet, but we certainly will build on the model, and there will be other ways of experiencing that. And then there will be the space, the museum, or Laura gave us, or the two curators. I'm new in the field there, but I have the pleasure to fill 3 spaces, and they couldn't be more different than from each other. And one is a kind of a classic gallery space, but very tall, which we use for the historic material and a lot of historic models, original drawings from the various archives. And the most difficult space is a former ice skating rink, which now we, talking through it, also how it was previously used and what is most successful. And at some point, somebody brought up that there's a lot of school kids coming, especially in the morning. And I also have 2 kids. And I was like, why not making something like very large scale to climb on, or eventually a bouncy castle, like one of these. And I know this might sound very un-museum-like, but so far we have had open ears, and so that would be one idea, to really engage with every generation about what New York could have been, or the unbuilt, the never built New York. So.
I'll just add that you know, one of the threads that's constantly going through the thematics of themes of Queens Museum exhibitions is this relationship to the landscape of the city, the physical landscape, because we have the panorama of New York City, which was actually commissioned by Robert Moses in 1964 and is a 10,000 square foot scale model of every single building in New York City. There are about 854,000 tiny little wooden hand-painted buildings. It was all handmade over a 3-year period in advance of the fair, and it's sort of a central element of our displays at the Queens Museum, and it's something that's super useful. It's not only beautiful in its own right, but it also is a useful tool to see the city differently. And I think this exhibition, Never Built New York, is an extraordinary example of what that can be. So I'm really excited about it. Next fall at the Queens Museum.
Okay, I'm going to conclude. As Christian said, we're going to close this on a mood of monumentality, of saying how we go, like we have this tripartite structure when you're going from a kind of this criticism of our airspace and how it's affecting our cities. And I mean, there is so much literature and discussions, gentrification and Airbnb and so on, which we don't need to go over it here. Then from there, we go to the possibility of of third space, which we kind of agreed that fundamentally is based on memory, on human and social relations. So when you talk about monumentality, I guess that the future, I mean, of our cities, the future of our built environment, will be no longer, let's say, modern architecture in the same way that the grand plazas of the 19th century. Also, let's say, like the development of certain models for historical museums, like the Jewish Museum in Berlin and other museums of that kind, have kind of articulated memory in a very relational way. I guess that, I mean, we don't know what the next installment of history is going to bring. Things are looking so-so in this country, but we can always hope that really brilliant people like these speakers they have in this panel will do their best, and I guess that we should put our faith in that. So thank you guys for your time, for sharing your precious knowledge. And now we're going to open the floor to take some questions.
Hi. So I had a question primarily for Christian. So you mentioned feeling like the privatization or that kind of homogenization of space. Oh, okay. You mentioned the privatization and the homogenization of space being incompatible with what you felt was really valuable about life. And I wonder if you could point to maybe something more specific there, or if there were ways that we could look at privatization and say, how can we make that more compatible with what we care about, with what we value? Does that make sense?
Maybe I use a very small example in terms of scale, but it fits very much to an art fair. It was a small installation, which was a competition that I won for Art Basel. And actually, the client was not Art Basel, but it was in Art Basel, Hong Kong, for the Asia Art Archive. And they have Art Basel gives them every year. It's a non-for-profit, and they get a free booth in the entrance area where some of the neighbors were like Taschenbooks, and then there were other non-for-profits, and it's just one of these kind of a sliver of space that they get every year. And it was a competition, and I proposed them kind of a Greek theater on a very small scale. It's for lectures, it's for performances, talks, similar to this here. Some very informal, others a little bit more staged. And I just felt the most simple gesture would really be to do this kind of small-scale amphitheater. And what was interesting for me being there for a whole week was that very often this very commercial environment, which we inhabit right now, sitting here, has moments where people just want to sit, and some check their emails like we all do these days, but a lot of times it was just people were sitting there, gathering, and it was stepping up. So you actually could sit on a higher step, and you could just you were part of the big mob, the scene, the crowd, but you also had a very private and personal moment. And I think it was not planned, I have to say. I mean, I planned to make a social space, but I was not thinking of all the times when it is not in use, because they had quite a dense program. Like every hour there was a new program and so on. But all these in-between hours or minutes were really the most or the most surprising to me, that people would just engage with these stairs. And it kind of had that urban moment when you go to the Spanish steps in Rome, or, I mean, every city, or even stoops. I mean, how many people have a stoop in front of their house, and all of a sudden you have somebody eating a sandwich there? I think that's a great thing, even though it is my stoop, and sometimes they leave their sandwich paper there. But I think those are moments where I think actually that's when architecture can contribute something to us inhabiting a place.
Okay, should we take the next question here? Yeah.
Hello, Matías. I would like to ask you if the reason that what I understood, that you prefer the house, the flat house that you have in the country, in comparison with the other projects that you have in the city, in buildings. There was no nature. I think the key that I got is that you were missing nature. Is that a...
It's a nice question because I...
Or not?
I mean, I'm not prefer.
No, the presence of nature is what it really characterized your house that was changing because nature was collaborating with you.
Yes.
Was a collaboration between you and nature.
Well, this platform is like an UFO. I mean, it's affecting the nature, but at the same time, it's affected by the nature. So I just build the platform and I wait. I mean, I'm not controlling the situation. I'm just I don't know if it's okay.
I guess that where is the... Are we good? Okay, so thank you so much for your time. And
thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arie.